Okay, Herman Deal here. We are here with the Better Wealth and Health podcast. And today I have Kevin Spencer Beckford. He is with a company and he founded a company called Finding Your Cup. I really love that name. So, with that company, that unique name, Finding Your Cup, what does finding your cup mean, and how did that idea become the foundation of your work, Kevin?
Yeah, it's actually kind of a cool idea. I first of all, for context, I'm originally I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and I ended up spending about 18 years living in the Caribbean between two islands in another neighboring Caribbean country called the Bahamas. So I lived in Nassau for about 14 years,
Cool.
And then Freeport Grand, Bahama for about 4 years. I spent most of my summers in
Yeah.
Jamaica with my grandparents. So going to the beach for us was like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It was a daily occurrence because, when you're on an island, typically like the four-star island I lived on was 7 miles at its widest point and by 21 at its longest, like a football. So no matter where you go,
Right.
you are seeing the water. And so it's just a beautiful way to live. And so my mom, had this really great approach in life that said, people will tell you a problem is as big as the ocean, so they walk away from doing anything. And you develop a sense of apathy into situations that could be changed. And so the question she would say
Yeah.
is, it's not about the ocean, it's about what's your proximity to the problem. How close are you to the ocean? What's your agency, your position,
Okay.
your power, your position, power, and agency to take action on the
So
water?
this is viewing the ocean as something, as a problem, or
So,
how are you viewing the ocean?
so in other words, people will equate a problem to the ocean, and then as a way to creating paralysis and doing anything. They say, "Oh, that's you. You can't boil the ocean." Sometimes you hear that, right? And so the
Right.
question is,
Right.
she said, it's never about the ocean. It's about you and what's your cup. And so everyone has a cup, and that cup essentially is I could take that cup, dip it into the ocean of this problem, and work on that. And if I get done
Right.
with it, I go back again. And then ultimately, I may inspire somebody to do the same. And so it's a
It
very
rem-
simple approach in
yeah.
life.
This reminds me of that saying where there are all these starfish on the beach,
Yep.
and a child is picking one up, throwing it into the ocean, saving that starfish because I guess there was a storm and the starfishes went in. And an older gentleman says, "What are you? Why are you doing that? They're all going to die anyway." But he picks one up, throws it in, but not that one. And
Yeah.
so he feels he's making a difference. Yeah,
I tell you, that's a great analogy, by the way. And I've heard that once I came to the United States, and I heard that. And to me, it's the same lens, right? And essentially, it's a lens that you have or prescription you have in your lens, if you will, on how you see the world. And it's
yeah,
not something that turns at 8 a.m. and stops at 6 p.m. It's really how you just look, how you navigate through the world. It's a constant understanding of a sense of being awake and aware, and to the fact that you can, each of us individually, make the world a little bit better than we met it, make that room a little bit better, make that culture a little bit
yeah.
better. And so it's a very basic concept that has been the through line throughout my life and showed up when I went into the corporate world after I got out of college and started working in the corporate sector. And so I spent 30 years essentially bringing that to every job I've gone into. And it turns out I have a real knack for transition and change. So it became a really good marriage.
Yeah. Great. And I want to let everyone know, I didn't mention it before, but we are here with Stand Up Energy. We are standing up. I'm down in Miami, Florida. Kevin is in Rochester, New York, but we are on Stand Up Energy. So you have worked in leadership, business transformation, banking, healthcare, education, and community service. What have those different experiences taught you about what makes an effective leader?
I think a leader that understands their role, and there's a difference between managing and leading. And so, to
Mhm.
me, people conflate those, and they're not the same. You know the difference between somebody who's managing, which is essentially getting things done, A leader is a person
Right.
who is able to be empathetic and thoughtful, that cares and inspires and empowers. Those are all very
Right.
different sort of aspects of that culture. And so for me, I'm a servant leader at its core. I would say probably the first example, it was a little bit more of a religious example, but it's one that planted that seed for me, was that as a kid growing up, we grew up Catholic in the islands. And I remember one day, one of our services, they had a kind of their little skit of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples and at the front of our church. And I remember turning to my dad. I was probably about 9 at the time. And I said, I'm confused, Daddy. Like, if that's God's son, why is he washing the disciples' feet? And my dad simply said, he said, he's letting them know that's how leaders are supposed to operate. Leaders are supposed to serve. And he's modeling that behavior so they can go out and model it with the people. And it just stuck with me.
Right.
And so for me, there's a clarity in my mind around my role in any group. I'm the biggest servant. If the bigger the group, I'm the biggest servant. So when I look at an org chart in my office, I generally turn it upside down and redo it so that it shows me supporting and serving all the folks that are in the organization that I'm entrusted to manage and to lead.
That's an interesting, yeah, taking the org chart, turning it around. I would imagine, though, and I know leaders go through this too, that then you feel that pressure. You sort of feel like you're carrying all these people on your shoulders. And in a way, you are, because the decisions you make, especially in a business, will determine if a lot of those people with the upside down org shot continue their jobs or not. So I would imagine, how do you balance that pressure that you're carrying them with also serving them? That's like, those are very competing
Yeah,
ideas of thought.
that's the first time I've been asked that question, and it's really simple. First of all, um, being a servant to the group, as a servant leader for the group, it doesn't mean you're carrying. Essentially, it just makes it clear that your role is to serve, right? And the reason
Right.
why that there's a distinction with a huge difference is because when I had a group of 26 people in my first leadership assignment, there's 26 human beings, 26 minds, thoughts, backgrounds, cultures, experiences. And so for me, I don't feel the weight of providing all the solutions because I'm just one of many. My role is just entrusted to serve and inspire and to remove obstacles out of the path of the people that I'm serving. And so it's really not so much a case of feeling the weight of it, understanding the importance of it. Yes, it does, which it means that when you go to make decisions, you don't make decisions based on just emotions alone or the emotions of the moment. You have to think about, for example, when an employee is presenting a certain way to you, that may, for most managers, may react and start making decisions and applying consequences. I am extremely thoughtful at those moments to just step back, abandon my ego, and to say, okay, this person's talking to me or presenting in a way that isn't congruent with maybe the leadership role that you're in, but realizing that there's a human being in front of you and that sometimes the
Right.
way they're presenting is really part of a much bigger problem. And so you want to first deal with that part of it and then, abandon your agenda, certainly if it's not like an emergency, to say, let me just kind of figure out where this person is right now and go from there.
Yeah. Okay. And you often talk about moving from concern to action. Why do so many people recognize problems but still struggle to take meaningful action? I guess I think they're of analysis paralysis. When people
Well,
struggle to take action.
Well, I think part of that is because they don't get enough practice. So, for example, I mentioned early on in one of my question answers is that, you know, having this prescription in your lens and how you look at the world, it should not just go on at 9 o'clock in the morning and you take them off at 6 in the evening when you're done with work. It really should be how you see the world. That actually puts you in a great position to be able to always being aware and awake and present, right? So if you're aware and
Hmm.
awake and present only Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, you're not going to get much practice. And also, you will think that that way of changing and navigating through the world should only be at work. And I just think it's really who should we should be as humans. And so, for example, I go to Starbucks, I go anywhere. I'm always thinking about, not just thinking about, being aware and awake to your surroundings to see, hey, there's a small ocean of a problem here in front of me. I think I have a role that I can play to really affect some change. Probably the most personal. I'll share a personal example with you. Right here in Rochester, New York, I was going to go to the gas station, get some water, and my wife and I were going to dinner that night. And I actually just pulled in quick. I said, I need some water. I feel a little thirsty. Parked in front of the gas station, went in. I'm doing a self checkout, and to my right, there was a woman that was in her probably mid to late no, probably late 20s, that was looked a little bit disheveled and was being checked out by the employee. And I happened to notice at one point he said, "Well, you don't have enough, And she said, "Can you take some of the stuff off so I can get it to where I can afford it?" And so at that moment, because I'm aware, I noticed it. My natural inclination is to say, I think it doesn't look like it's not like it was $200 worth of groceries, and I may not have that in my pocket.
Right.
I just, excuse me, ma'am. I said, if you don't mind, I said, my name's Kevin. I said, if you don't mind, it would be an honor to really get those few items for you. So if you don't mind, you can put them back on. I'll take care of it for you. And she said, "Oh, thank you," and she looked a little bit nervous, like, "Well, who's this guy?" So I took care of it. She checked out, she left. I had to finish checking out my water. And as I was walking out the store, I happened to see her there. And she was just like in tears, like quiet, like wasn't bawling, was just tears streaming there. And I said, "Hey, ma'am," I said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Is there anything I can do?" And she says, "No, it's okay." I said, "No, I'm really asking." I said, "If there's something I could do, I would love to help." I said, "You need to get something else." So I thought maybe she didn't get something. And she says, "No," she says, "it's really complicated." I said, "Well, I'm okay." I said, I'm here." She says, "Well, I was in rehab down the street and I left early because I got nervous. And now I realize it was the biggest mistake I ever made and I didn't know what to do." I said, "Well, how'd you get here?" She said, "I walked." I said, and I knew where she was coming from because I passed that rehab like every week. And I said,
Okay.
would you like me to take you back? And then I can talk to the administrator to see if we can get you back in. She said, "I don't know if they will because usually if you leave, you can't go back." I said, "Well, we can give it a shot if you don't mind." I said, "All right." I said, "Well, listen," I said, "it's my wife in the car there, making sure she felt comfortable getting in the car with me." And her and I took her back, and we walked in. I asked to speak to whoever was in charge. I let him know what was happening. I said, "Listen, I know you probably have a rule against this, but you please." The fact that she regrets the decision right after she left, I would imagine, is powerful. So I'm going to ask you at least to talk to her and see what happens. And they took her back in, and it was just
Right.
a small example of being aware, awake, and it turns
Yeah.
out I had a opportunity in my cup of change to make that situation better.
That's cool. I can't help but that reminds me of a story that happened to me several months ago, which is a different take from your story, which is a little weird, but I actually did a post on it. And I was at a Latin grocery store, and this man tells me, "Hey, can you get me a little bit of rice and beans?" And I looked at him and I could tell because he was like very skinny arms and legs, but he kind of had like a big belly. And that is just a very obvious sign often of diabetes. I'm already thinking he probably has diabetes. He
Oh
looked to
dear.
be like a man in his 60s, 50s, a little older than me. And I said, "But should you really be eating that?" I mean, I come from, and Kevin, you don't know this about me, but I do help clients and I do promote kind of like a ketogenic animal-based diet. And then he tells me how he has diabetes
Mm.
and he's on metformin. And I'm like, "Okay, you're on metformin, you have diabetes." And he's, "Yeah, but a little bit of rice and beans, that would be fantastic." I go, "Well, you," and I'm thinking to myself, there's a part of me where, should I try to educate him? Should I just buy it? Or should I try to educate? Like, as again, in my book, If you have diabetes, what a lot of people don't realize is that rice and beans turns completely into sugar. It takes
Mm,
longer. It's better than eating junk food. We all know that. But rice and bean are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates just a string of sugar. It still becomes sugar. And so I tell them, even if it costs more, I'll buy you a piece of meat. Whatever meat you want. They have ribs, chicken, fish. I'll get you a piece of meat. He's like, nah, I wanted the rice and beans. And he walks away, asks someone else, and someone else buys it for him. And I thought to myself, did I do the right thing? I mean, in my book, I feel like I did because I feel
hmm
that giving him rice and beans when he's on metformin and has diabetes, it's not going to help him. And part of the problem is that he may really believe that the rice and beans are good for him, like a lot of people do. But when you have diabetes, no, it's not ideal at all. And so, anyway, yeah, we all have our, I guess, way of doing things, and I can't help but bring up the curiosity because, and I don't know, and if, and I guess that's where ethics and morality, it's a vague thing, right? It's something that actually can change, because I know me personally, if someone is buying groceries and they're buying a bunch of junk food,
yes,
I'm not going to help them. Like, I'm just not. Like, I don't care if they're even, there might, I mean, if they're kids, I might make an exception, but like, why would I want to contribute to someone's unhealthy habit or, and especially if they came from an addiction place? I mean, I've heard that some people who get very addicted, when they're getting through drug rehab and all of that, one of the things they say you can't do is drink like very stimulant sweets like junk food, because that can contribute to addiction. Because when you get addicted to junk food, it's one addiction, and often one addiction leads to another addiction. And
yes,
so yeah, there's always, that's why, like, yeah, ethics is something that changes. And I think the main principle is to just look out for people, try to help people
yeah,
as best you can and as best you can understand. And
yeah.
speaking of,
That's a tough one.
yeah,
I had to be honest. That's a tough one
yeah,
because I've had to navigate a couple of those types of intersections before, where the person's asking for money, but you're concerned they might use it, but they usually use it to, I need some money to buy food. So I said, all right, well, how about I
right,
get you the food? I get you the food. Right. And so
right.
even though it might not be the greatest food in the world, if they're hungry, at least I give them something to eat. And so, but I won't give them the money because I know that there's a good chance it might not go to food, it'll go to something else.
Right, right. Yeah. It can be a dilemma. And speaking of that, when an organization is struggling, how do you identify whether the real problem is strategy, systems, leadership, or its culture?
I'll be very honest with you. This is the secret sauce to my approach is you don't know until you ask. And so I'll give you, for example, the 18 years I spent with Eastman Kodak, 12 of those were in leadership roles. My very first leadership role was at the age of 30. I'm 61 today. In that role, I inherited a group of call center operators who was one of 18 groups, 16 groups, 8 in Rochester and 8 in Colorado. And at the time, it was the lowest performing. In one year, we became the number two group, just behind, right behind the number one group, and did it 2 years in a row. Step back a little bit to the beginning. When I came in place, they didn't have any turnover at all. They were pretty stable because Kodak was a really good company with good benefits, but people were very unhappy. They had about a 72%, somewhere like low 70s in terms of employee satisfaction with the company. But they were very unhappy and they knew they weren't performing well. Everybody knew it. And so it became this point of contention when they would even go to lunch. I got in there
Mm.
realizing, well, let me find out what the problem is. So what I did is I started meeting with the team individually and as a group, found out they'd had three leaders in a very short period of time. Nobody had actually stayed more than a year. And so they were looking at me as the next leader that was going to leave in less than a year. And so I had to really first convince them that I was here to stay. In fact, I really genuinely wanted to know what was happening and how could I serve them better. And so as my first sort of like,
Hmm.
training wheels still on, in terms of servant leadership. And I found out the problem was had nothing to do with the calls coming in. It had nothing to do with all of those things. It had simply something to do with that they didn't even understand the value of the work they were providing. They thought they were answering
Mm,
calls. And so what I was able to do was to restructure by creating 2 meetings a month, because at any given time, 26 people were off the phone out of these 16 groups. I just made it my team for 1 hour twice a month. And so one meeting was dedicated to bringing people in to talk about the stuff that was upstream and downstream from what we were doing, to really help them to understand the
okay.
value of our work. Once they did that, I was able to then identify areas of training that they were missing. And so then I was able to then put together a dedicated training plan for each person to close the gap on things that they were doing, helping them to understand what talk time was, helping them to understand what the quality scores were like and the calls per hour and availability. Like they didn't fully appreciate the business part of the plan. And so I discovered very quickly over time, once they started closing the gap on that, we not only our numbers went up, they saw that there was a care and attention that I took towards that. And so I share that example with you was because most organizations, when they see a problem, they make the assumption that is the problem. And then generally that problem
Right.
that you're seeing, there's a scaffolding behind it that may be multiple root cause problems, and you're just seeing that sort of the symptom of it. And so for me,
Yeah.
you have to, make build the right kind of relationship with your employees that they see and believe that you're there to serve them. And so they will be able to then serve your customer and the business. And so sometimes it's all the above. Most of the roles that I've gotten into, it's all the above because if you let a problem with people go long enough, it affects your culture. If your culture is affected long
Right.
enough, then it affects your performance. So generally, the longer the problem, the more invasive the problem is within your company, just like in the human body, right? If I get a nick on my finger and I
Yeah.
ignore it long enough, it'll turn into not just an infection. I could end up getting gangrene, and before you know it, the whole arm's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. The problem tends to get bigger. And I like the idea of you have to ask, first, like you have to ask for sure.
Yeah.
Often the best answer is another question, a better
Yes.
question. Yeah. So, how can business leaders pursue financial success while also creating a positive impact on their employees and communities?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that they're not mutually exclusive. That's the first thing,
Hmm.
right? Like so, for example, every one of the turnaround. Like if you look at my LinkedIn, anybody watching the podcast, you look at Kevin S. Beckford, you will look at my each job was a different problem I was being asked to solve, and it's all over the map, right? Because I'm not bringing the content expertise, although I eventually get it when I'm solving the problem for the business. I'm bringing that management discipline, everything you just heard me talk about. And so one of the most biggest fallacies in most companies is they believe that if you have happy employees, you have lower profits or you have higher costs.
Hmm.
And what I've been able to
Right.
demonstrate, not in one assignment, but in 30 years worth of assignments. So, for example, let me pick the group and I'll pick on a different group. When I got recruited away from Kodak to go into banking, my very
Hmm.
first job in banking, which is unheard of. Usually bankers start small and grow up. I walk in as a
Right.
vice president, group operations manager for the Southeast region. But the person who hired me was a former Kodak executive that knew my work. And so they brought
Okay.
me in to take over the Southeast region for a financial investigative team. If there's any bankers watching this, research and adjustment is not a place to start your banking career because you have to usually have gone through all these groups first, returns, exceptions, and so on. I walk
Yeah.
in, we had a 30% turnover of staff. We had we were missing all of our financial targets. In fact, we were writing off cases every 90 days that we never got a chance to touch. So we were really kind of
Mm.
a cost center in a huge way. We were basically writing off sometimes as much as 70 to 90 to $650,000 a month. And cases we could have solved if we had gotten a chance to touch them because there were cases coming in every day that 110 employees couldn't meet. They had
Okay.
two or three leaders they had in there over a period of time. When they recruited me to come in, I came in, same approach, sit down, talk, get to know the folks, ask questions. I found the root cause in the first week. It was very simple. They did not have a
Hmm.
formal training program. So when they grew from 40
Yeah.
people to 110 people, people didn't know how to do the job. And so therefore, I hired a dedicated director of training, commissioned him to put together a world-class training program that when people got out of that training program, they were meeting enterprise goal day one. And then a month or two later, they were 20% above the goal. So it looked like I hired a person for every
Right.
5 people I had. So all of a sudden now we started turning things around because people realized that I was coming in to ask, listen, act. Well, guess what?
Right.
That group, their overall dissatisfaction scores for the employees went from 70%, and typically it was 85 at the bank. I went to 89% in 1 year and maintained that the second year. So people were not just happier, they felt treated and empowered, and they understood the value of their work. So what that translated into is that we were now an income center. We were now working cases other banks were charging off. So
Hmm.
we were now bringing in 50,000 plus a month of cases that we were able to now charge on as a credit because the other banks had given up because they didn't get to it. And so
Yeah.
we became the number one performing across the nation. Bank of America had six of these groups, and they ended up closing down the one in Dallas. I was able to absorb 60 FTEs, full-time equivalents worth of work, but only hiring 30 people. And so
Wow.
I remember my peers came down. We ended up having my executive for enterprise had our annual or meeting there, and they came down to say, what are they doing in Tampa? And the running joke was, Kevin, what are you feeding your people? You know, I said,
Hmm.
good service. I said, and at the
Yeah.
end of the day, it was a perfect example of where we had turnover that went from 30% to 12 and a half in 6 months, 6% at the end of the year, which is a pretty healthy turnover rate in terms of
Yeah.
a moving
Big
culture.
improvement from 30 before. Yeah.
Well, the key is that at the core of your question is that most business leaders believe that there's a cost. In fact, I'll never forget one of my peers. I won't say his name because he's retired now, but I remember him saying, "He says, Kev, I know you're number one." He says, "But I'm looking around and your people look a little bit too happy." He says, "I think you could probably get those numbers even higher." I said, "What would be the value of that extra productivity at the cost of the happiness of my employees?" I said, "My happiness of my employees is why I'm getting what I'm getting. If I try to get enough to
Right.
really make them less happy, guess what? At some point, that's going to fail." So I have what's called
Yeah.
consistent performance. You know why? Because I'm not doing that. I've fostered and created a culture and environment where they understand the value of their work and they're doing the work and they see value that I value them.
Yeah. I like what you said there about ask, listen, act. That sounds like a very beautiful acronym, ALA, the ALA system. Ask, listen, act. I kind of like that. Like I see a motivational speaker just using that. If anyone takes this, they need to pay me money. Okay. I came up with this first. The ALA method. Ask, listen, act. I like that. That makes a whole lot of sense. Ask, listen, act. Okay, the ALA system.
Yeah.
Okay, so final question we have for you here on because you have a podcast and we haven't spoken about that yet, but it's called the Solution Cup Podcast. You encourage people to fill their cup with purpose and pour it back into their communities. How can someone discover where their own skills, experience, and purpose can make the greatest difference?
Boy, that's a really great question. Well, I tell you, the reason I started the podcast is because I spent 30 years now in the corporate world. So, 18 years in Kodak, 10 years in banking, 7 years in healthcare. Now I have my small consulting company, and I'm actually writing a couple of books right now. One's more personal on being a first generation immigrant. And then the other one's really about this sort of way of navigating the world. And I believe that everyone, and I actually mentor people on this. So, for example, I had somebody come to me the other day and said, "Hey, listen, I don't necessarily want to do this just for work. I want to figure out like how do I put this prescription in I hear you talk about?" Because I give speeches locally here too as well. And what it does is start with where you are. Start small. I give you one simple one you can do today. If you go to coffee every day, get coffee, no matter where you're in line somewhere or something, you name it. When you go, when you go to place your order through that microphone in the drive-through, just say, "Hey, listen, I'd like to do a random act of kindness. The person that's in front of me that you just took your order. Can you tell me how much the bill is, just so you don't get yourself in financial difficulty? And just say, I'd like to pay for their bill. I want to get an idea of how much it costs first, so I don't get surprised. And just tell them it's on me, and all the best, and pay it forward. And then see how you feel inside. You
Okay,
know,
so let me understand this. Wait. So you're paying for the person who came before you, but they're already paid, no?
No, they just placed the order. They're not at the window yet. Yeah, so you
Okay,
know what
okay.
I'm talking about the drive-through. So you place your
Right, the
order,
drive-through.
you get the food and you pay. But if they just place the order, you're about to place yours. You By the time they get their food, they're going like, hey, it's on you. You know, the guy just said to pay it forward. Have a good day. And so it's a
Okay,
random act of kindness. And the reason I mention that is
yeah,
that when you start small, you start to realize with that very small act, hey, I can do that. Or
right.
if you see something, just being more aware. In fact, it's interesting because I'm giving a talk in a couple months in October for this national group that meets every 2 years. And so I just shared with them the slides I'm going to be sharing with them, and they're actually going to work on something over the 2 years of, like, it's called, first of all, being aware of your surroundings, like training
Hmm.
yourself to look up, stop looking down on your phone, right? And look up and then look around, and to be more aware of who's in the room with you, who's not in the room with you. What's the dynamic? Is there somebody that's looking a little bit on the sad side of town? Somebody that's looking a little bit sort of, you could tell that maybe not having a good day. And if you're planning on staying there that day, and maybe don't, instead of getting a table by yourself, just say, do you mind terribly if I sit with you here? I said, if you don't mind, if you're okay with that. And then while you're there, try to read the room a little bit to see, you might be able to make a difference in a person's day by just saying, hey, you start developing your social skills and how to do that. And so it's a way to really start to test out how you can make a difference in the world, and in a way that, can really start to create change. Because once you start to do that, you start to think of more creative ideas and how you can move that forward. And particularly, so that's a personal level. At a work level, it's very simple. If you're a leader, next time you go back into the office, one of the first things I would ask you to do is go have HR send you information and all your employees that say, hey, listen, I know it's that time, not that time of the year to do pay raises, but I want to kind of take a look at pay equity. I want to make sure that I have some clarity on whether or not has that lens ever been applied, because I may have inherited these employees and I didn't set the stage for it. I do that in every assignment I take on for the first time. There's not one assignment I didn't find a pay equity issue, which means everybody's passing it and they move on to the next job as a
Yeah.
leader. And one of the most egregious examples I found,
And
I found
I
it.
imagine you're more for transparency in the pay.
Absolutely. Well, not just
Yeah.
that, but as a leader, one of the most fundamental things you can do for your employees is be an advocate for them. And so for
Hmm.
me, it's not accept. Like, for example, I walked into this one group, I'll never forget. It was in IT at Eastman Kodak, and that's one of the first things I do, because I want to make sure that, who are the people, what are they doing, are they being paid in a fair and equitable way? Because the best time to ask that is when you first take over a group, because you have the most power at that
Right.
point. Because then you can go to HR and go, hey, I just inherited this group. I see a discrepancy. It's pretty significant. It's a pay equity issue that could really create a problem for that employee in the company. So I need
Right.
a off cycle adjustment. One of the biggest adjustments I was able to fix was a 30% difference between what a person was being paid compared to some of their peers. And every manager they
Hmm.
had over the years ignored that. And this person had been doing the same work.
Hmm.
And so what that did is that immediately showed, it sent a very strong message to the team that pay equity was important because I care about you. You don't have to ask me for
Right.
that. Pay equity should be something you ask for. And by the way, every single job, like, in fact, I became an elected official. I mean, I wasn't part of my
Yeah.
plan, but I happened to be in an area that was having some issues of race, and I decided to get involved to help create a change. And I
Hmm.
discovered that the people in my town, the town supervisor and the four people running the town, they were absent completely. So I decided to run
Yeah.
for office. I'm the first African American to be elected in my town in our 220-year history.
Hmm.
And then one of the first thing I did was I got our finance people in. I said, can we just take a look at our pay? It turns out we were paying
Yeah.
people a poverty wage. So I was able to
Right.
codify that. So now I'm an elected official. So I passed a amendment to our budget that
Hmm.
codified paying a livable wage to entry level employees. I mean, that sent a shockwaves throughout the employees that today they now demand more pay equity because they realize that that's something, because after I
Yeah.
left the board, they apparently did not continue doing that. And they
You
ended
created
up in
that
trouble.
culture. You created that culture of pay
Yeah,
equity. Yeah.
you got it.
Great. Great. Well, Kevin, this has been a pleasure. Give us any information you want for other individuals out there. Tell us about your, when the Solution Cup podcast comes out, or any other information you want others out there to know about so they could contact you or get more information from you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So in fact, my if you're on LinkedIn, if you type in Kevin S, it's for Spencer, Beckford, it'll come up right away because I've quite a bit of a following. If you go on any place that you have podcasts and just type in the Solution Cup. So my company is called Finding Your Cup. I ended up the podcast name is the Solution Cup, and it's going to about 20 different outlets. It's on Pandora, Apple. My goodness, everything you can think. In fact, it's going to multiple
Yeah. Where all
countries.
the
I have people,
podcasts play.
all the
Yeah.
podcasts play, and so and the essentially what I'm going to be doing is interviewing. And it's brand new, by the way. So I just launched the pilot, and now we're lining up all the different other people we're going to be speaking with. I think Senator Brooks, New York State Senator Brooks, is going to be the next person I end up interviewing, and it's someone that some of the work I was doing. It's kind of a really good example of where I was working on my cup of change in Pittsford, New York. She flew in from New York to sit on one of my panels, saw the work I was doing in the town she grew up in, and she and her husband moved back to Rochester. She ran for office, became senator. And so the reason why I'm
Okay.
interviewing her is because our cups collided, where she saw me, exercising my cup of change in her town, and said, "I could do that. I'm going to run for office." And then she now is the
Cool.
senator. And the senator is one of the youngest African American female senators in New York right now, and creating some wonderful work
Right.
changes. And so that's if you're interested in being a guest on a podcast, or just in fact, if you want to sponsor it, that's probably a good thing too as well. Because I'm going to pick four core founding sponsors that I will be mentioning every podcast for the year. My goal this year is really
Hmm.
simple with the podcast. I want to make sure I have sponsors that underwrite the program, which is not a whole lot. It's filmed in WXXI Studios here in Rochester, New York, and then so I can focus on the content. I'm not
Right.
looking at it as a kind of a money maker. At some point, it may make money, but for right now, I want to create a platform to showcase people that are doing the work I just did the last 30 years in the corporate world, but in different spaces and places. I want to give them a platform and a voice.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I should
Great.
also say if you have a company, small, big, large, it doesn't matter. Problems that you can't fix. I've been able to turn around call center operations, IT infrastructure, marketing communications, supply chain purchasing, financial investigation teams. And so there's no problem that's too difficult that I'm not afraid to tackle. And also,
Yeah.
even just as a coach, if you're a CEO and need some help, I've done that too, in helping CEOs that are new, particularly in startups, to help them to be more efficient. So thank you for this opportunity, Herman. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. We got a lot of good information here, a lot of good tips, and I'm going to talk 2 minutes now on something with fitness. A lot of people ask me, should you do compound movements, or when you work out, should you isolate your muscles? And an isolated movement would be something like if you're doing a bicep curls, you're looking to just build up the bicep muscle. I prefer compound movements. A compound movement would be something like you do a pull up or a lat pull down. Because when you do that type of movement, you're working your biceps, but you're also working your back. Similar to like a push up. A push up would be a compound movement. When you do a push up, you're working your chest and your triceps at the same time. Now, you can do an exercise like a triceps pull down where you're isolating the triceps, or a skull crusher where you're isolating this muscle. But compound movements just means you're using more muscles. And generally speaking, it's better and it's easier. So I have some simple exercise. For example, on a push day, I really, for the upper body, I really only recommend 3 exercises. That's all you need to do. One exercise going straight up, a compound movement like a shoulder press going straight up, going straight out in front of you. That would be like a chest press or a push up. and then going straight down, preferably in a dip format, so that you're carrying your body weight and you're going down in a dip. And when you're carrying your body weight, a dip or a pull up, you're also getting a fantastic core workout. So you're not just working out your triceps, but you're also working out your chest, your core, and everything at the same time. It's just more efficient and it keeps the workout time to a minimum, which is important for a lot of the executive men that I help train. In any case, that was the fifth tip for today. Thank you once again, Kevin Spencer Beckford from Rochester, New York. I really appreciate answering the questions. We got into a lot of interesting things here, examples that you had. You made me come up with some examples in my life. So thank you. It has been a pleasure. And it's been great stand-up energy for all of you out there. Thanks for watching on YouTube or hearing us. Bye-bye.